I stood up and walked to the window. The backyard looked smaller now. The same garden where he'd made me dig trenches for weeds, where I'd stood for hours waiting for him to decide my punishment. It looked peaceful now, untouched. I used to think I'd never come back here, I said quietly, but I guess you can't escape where you came from. It stays in you. He nodded. It does. There was nothing else to say. I left his room, closing the door gently behind me. My mother was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, tears in her eyes. She didn't ask what we talked about. She just hugged me, tighter than she ever had before. That night, I stayed in my old room. The wallpaper was faded, the bed smaller than I remembered. I sat on the edge, listening to the sounds of the house, the wind outside, the creak of wood, the faint hum of the clock. All the ghosts of my childhood lived there, but they were quieter now. In the middle of the night, I woke to silence, a silence too deep, too final. I knew before my mother called my name. He was gone. At his funeral, I stood by the grave and realized I didn't feel anger anymore, just a strange, aching peace. Maybe because I understood that his control wasn't born from strength, but from fear, the same fear that had once lived in me. When the last of the guests left, I stayed behind. The sky had turned golden with dusk. I knelt down, brushed the dirt from the fresh grave, and whispered, "I learned your lessons, Dad, but I rewrote them." I walked away from that cemetery and didn't look back. Years later, I'd find myself standing in front of a classroom teaching psychology to students barely older than I was when the rules first began. I talked about control, about fear, about the fine line between discipline and destruction. But what I really taught, though I never said it out loud, was how to break the cycle. Sometimes, when the world goes quiet, I still hear that belt. But it's not a sound of fear anymore. It's a reminder that I survived him, that obedience doesn't define love, and that no child should have to earn peace. By the time I turned 12, the silence in our home had become a second language. We spoke through glances, pauses, and the measured way my father's footsteps echoed down the hallway. Even laughter, that light human sound, had become something forbidden. My mother had learned to smile without teeth, my sister without sound, and me, I learned to disappear into obedience. But the small crack inside me, the one that began the night of the belt, was still there, quiet but alive. I carried it like a secret, something fragile but strangely comforting. Sometimes, when my father would talk about discipline and obedience, I would nod, pretending to agree, while my thoughts drifted somewhere else, to a world where rules didn't measure love. It was a Sunday morning, one of those still days when the world outside looked too calm to be real. My father was in the living room polishing his shoes, the scent of leather thick in the air. The radio played faintly in the background, some old 80s tune that made the moment feel too soft for what it really was. My mother moved quietly behind him, dusting shelves that were already spotless. I was supposed to be upstairs finishing my homework, but instead I was sitting on my bed, staring out the window. The neighbors' kids were playing catch, shouting, laughing, falling, the kind of chaos that looked like freedom. I didn't realize how long I'd been watching until I heard my father's voice behind me. "You're supposed to be working," he said. His reflection stared back at me from the window glass, tall, neat, expressionless. I turned slowly, heart pounding. He raised a hand. That was enough. No words were needed. He didn't hit me that time. He didn't have to. The punishment was colder than that. He simply walked to my desk, opened my notebook, and began tearing out the pages, one by one, until nothing remained. "If your mind wanders, you start over," he said. "Perfection requires focus."
That night, I rewrote every line until my fingers ached. The house was dark, quiet, except for the scratch of my pencil and the ticking of the clock on the wall. I used to think that if I could just survive long enough, maybe he'd stop needing to control me. Maybe growing up meant freedom. But the older I got, the more I realized freedom wasn't something he believed in. To him, control was love, and obedience was identity. When I turned 13, things shifted again. My voice began to change, deeper, uncertain, and so did his tone. His lectures became sermons. His punishments became lessons. "The world outside doesn't care how you feel," he told me once while tightening his tie. "You will not be one of those weak boys who crumble when corrected." I remember looking at him and thinking how strange it was that he believed cruelty built strength. The real breaking point came over something small. It always did. Dinner. My mother had cooked stew that night, the same way she always did. Perfect portions, warm plates, no clutter on the table. We sat in silence as he ate, methodical as always. But then halfway through, he stopped. His eyes narrowed. "Who stirred this?" "I did," my mother said softly. He didn't respond, just turned his head toward me. "You were supposed to help her. Were you not in the kitchen?" I swallowed. "I was cleaning my room." "Did I tell you to clean your room?" The air in the room changed, thicker, colder. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she set down her spoon. "No, Father," I said. "So, you disobeyed me." It wasn't even the words that hurt. It was the calmness, the absolute certainty in his tone that turned everything into guilt. He stood up, slow, deliberate. "Stand," he ordered. My chair scraped against the floor. The belt came off with that same sound I had heard 100 times before. Sharp, metallic, final. But something in me refused to cry this time. I clenched my fists at my sides. The first hit burned through me like fire, but I stayed still. The second one came harder. Still, I didn't make a sound. He paused. "You think silence will save you?" he asked. I met his eyes, not with defiance, but with something else. Something quiet and dangerous. "I think you like it when I'm afraid," I said softly. The words came out before I could stop them. My mother gasped. The world seemed to stop. My father's face froze, not in rage, but in something worse. Disbelief. As if I had spoken a language forbidden in our home. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he put the belt down. "You'll regret that," he said, voice trembling just a little bit. "You'll regret learning the wrong kind of courage." That night, he didn't punish me. But somehow it was worse, because I could feel the storm gathering behind his silence, waiting, building. Every sound, every breath carried tension. Even the walls seemed to hold their breath. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what I had said, about whether I really believed it. Did he like my fear? Or did he just not know any other way to love? In the morning, I found my mother standing by the kitchen sink, eyes red from crying. She didn't look at me. "You shouldn't have said that," she whispered. "I know," I said. But deep down, I also knew something else. I couldn't keep saying yes forever. The crack inside me wasn't small anymore. It was spreading, slowly, quietly, beneath every rule he built. And I didn't realize it yet, but that was the beginning of the end. The moment obedience began to die inside me.
I was 9 when I learned that being myself came with a price. Our house stood at the edge of Maple Street, the kind of quiet suburban road where every front yard looked the same and every father seemed to mow his lawn on Saturday mornings. From the outside, our family looked just as ordinary, The white picket fence, the trimmed hedges, the porch light that flickered on exactly at 7. But inside, everything followed rules. Rules my father never wrote down, but we all knew by heart. He believed that discipline made a man out of a boy. He said it often, like a sermon, not a sentence. A boy without rules grows into a man without purpose. He'd say it while tightening his belt or while staring at the dinner table, his jaw locked, waiting for one of us to speak out of turn. My mother never did. She was a shadow beside him, moving silently, placing plates in front of us like she was performing a ritual. Her smile was soft but never steady. I used to think she loved me in silence, because love wasn't allowed to make noise in our house. I wasn't a bad kid. I just made mistakes the way kids do, spilling milk, forgetting to say yes, father, fast enough, leaving my homework on the couch instead of in my bag. But in our home, mistakes were sins. They weren't corrected, they were punished. And punishment came wrapped in silence first, then sound. He never shouted. My father didn't need to. His eyes did the work. They could freeze the air around me, make me wish I could disappear into the wallpaper. The silence before his steps was worse than the belt that followed. That's when fear started to live inside me. Small at first, like a seed. It grew quietly, feeding on the hours I spent trying to be perfect. I learned how to breathe softly, how to smile without showing too much, how to sit still until my legs went numb. Because in that house, being human meant being wrong. Sometimes he would sit me across from him in the living room, where the ticking clock seemed louder than time itself. The smell of his aftershave, the polish on his shoes, the faint crackle from the fireplace. Everything was neat, in order, under his control. "Do you know why I do this?" he'd ask. I'd nod, even if I didn't, because not knowing was dangerous. "Because I love you," he'd say, his voice calm, almost gentle. And love without correction is weakness. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that pain meant love, that fear was a form of care. Children don't question the people who feed them, shelter them, or look at them with authority in their eyes. They just adapt. So I adapted. My room became a mirror of him, clean, organized, controlled. My toys sat in straight lines, my books stacked perfectly. Even the curtains hung at the same angle as the ones downstairs. I used to think that if I could make everything perfect, maybe he'd see me, not as a mistake, but as proof that his discipline worked. I used to imagine him walking into my room and saying, "Good job, son." But he never did. There was a small wooden cross above my bed. I remember staring at it on nights when my back burned from punishment. I wondered if God had rules too, and if he punished children for crying. I tried not to cry too loudly. It made my father's steps come back. School was the only place where I could breathe, but even there his voice followed me. Don't slouch, don't talk unless spoken to, don't show weakness. I watched other kids run, laugh, and fight over stupid things. They didn't understand what it meant to measure every word before speaking. They didn't live counting heartbeats in silence, waiting for footsteps down the hallway. I envied their freedom, but I didn't know what to do with envy either. It wasn't in the rules. The first time I disobeyed him, really disobeyed, was a small thing. I left the back door open. The wind pushed it wide, and the sound made him look up from his chair, his newspaper folded in half with precision. Who left the door open? I froze. My mother looked at me, her lips parting, then closing again. "I did," I said. The silence that followed felt endless. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He just stood up, slowly. His belt unbuckled with that sound, that familiar whisper of leather sliding through loops. And even though I was only 9, I knew that what hurt the most wasn't the sting of the belt. It was the look in his eyes, calm, disappointed, certain, like he was fixing me, like I was broken, and he was doing me a favor. That night when I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, something inside me changed.
I didn't have the words for it back then, but it felt like a crack in the mirror, the beginning of understanding that obedience and love weren't the same thing, that maybe, just maybe, my father's control wasn't about shaping me, it was about owning me. The next morning I said, "Good morning, Father," like nothing happened. That's what we did in our house. We erased pain before the sun came up. He nodded, satisfied. The rules had been restored. And yet, deep inside, something had started to stir, a quiet defiance I didn't recognize yet. It was the first time I wondered what it would feel like to say no.
It had been 15 years since I last saw that house. The day I left, I had promised myself I'd never look back, but promises made in pain rarely last forever. Time erodes them, reshaping them into quiet questions you can't escape. So when the letter arrived, my mother's familiar handwriting trembling across the envelope, I knew before opening it that he was dying. The drive back felt like moving through a tunnel between two lives. The closer I got to my old town, the more the air thickened, heavy with the smell of pine, wet soil, and old memory. The streets hadn't changed much. The same lampposts leaned slightly to the left, the same store sign flickered by the corner, the same church bell tolled every hour as if it never stopped counting. When I parked in front of the house, I just sat there for a while. The curtains were still drawn the same way, perfectly straight, perfectly still. I could almost hear the echoes of that clock ticking inside, the sound that once dictated every breath I took. My mother opened the door before I could knock. She looked smaller than I remembered, her hair streaked with gray, her smile stretched between relief and exhaustion. "He's upstairs," she said softly. He's not the same anymore." The air inside was colder than outside, filled with that faint mix of medicine and wood polish. Every creak of the floorboards felt like stepping into a memory. When I reached the top of the stairs, I hesitated outside his door. For a moment, I thought I couldn't do it, that maybe I'd just leave the letter on the table and walk away again. But I pushed the door open. He was sitting in a chair by the window, the same window where he used to stand every evening, watching the world without being part of it. The light fell across his face in sharp angles, and for a second I barely recognized him. The strong jaw had softened. His hands, once instruments of control, now trembled slightly on his lap. He looked at me. His eyes were still sharp, but there was something different in them, a kind of quiet that wasn't born from power, but from surrender. "You came," he said. I wasn't sure I should. He nodded slowly, as if he understood. "I didn't think you would, but your mother, she wanted to see you." We sat in silence for a while. The clock on his bedside table ticked softly, just like the one downstairs, steady, endless. "I've had a lot of time to think," he finally said, "about the way things were." I said nothing. I thought I was doing what was right, teaching you to be strong, to survive. His voice cracked. "But all I taught you was fear." Hearing those words from him didn't feel like victory. It didn't feel like closure either. It just felt empty, like the echo of something that should have come years ago. I used to tell myself it was discipline, but truth is, I was afraid too. Afraid of losing control. Afraid you'd grow up and see how small I really was. He looked at me then. Really looked. Like a man seeing his reflection for the first time. "I was wrong, son." I wanted to tell him I forgave him, that I understood. But forgiveness isn't simple. It isn't a word you can throw across years of silence and expect it to land safely. Instead, I said, "You did what you thought was right." He smiled faintly. "And it nearly broke you." The clock kept ticking. Each second felt heavier than the last. Then, almost to himself, he said,
I can still hear it sometimes. The sound of that belt. The sound of you not crying. That silence, it followed me.
I woke up the next morning to the sound of the clock, the same sound that had marked every hour of my life. It was always ticking, steady, constant, as if reminding me that time itself belonged to him. My father was already downstairs. I could hear his voice through the floorboards, low and firm, giving instructions to my mother about some trivial thing, the bills, the windows, the order of the shelves. I got dressed in silence, folding my bed sheets with the same precision he demanded. I used to think that if I followed the rules closely enough, he would see me as good, that maybe one day he'd smile and tell me I'd made him proud. But pride, in his world, wasn't something given. It was dangled, unreachable, like sunlight through a locked window. When I came downstairs, he was waiting at the table. The newspaper was folded beside his cup, untouched. He looked at me the way he always did, not like a father, but like a warden checking for weakness. "Sit," he said. I obeyed, the chair creaking softly beneath me. My mother hovered in the background, her eyes darting between us like a trapped bird. "I thought about what you said last night," he began. His voice was calm, but too calm, like the air before a thunderstorm. "You believe I enjoy your fear." I kept my eyes on the table. "I didn't mean, yes, you did. And maybe that's the problem. You think too much. You feel too much." He stood encircled behind me. His shoes clicked softly against the floor. "Discipline isn't cruelty, it's order. But you're starting to mistake my guidance for oppression. That ends today." My hands trembled slightly in my lap. The clock kept ticking. "Stand up," he said. My mother whispered something, almost pleading. He ignored her. I rose, my pulse loud in my ears. The air smelled faintly of leather and coffee, the scent of control. He reached for the belt that hung from the back of his chair. Slowly, deliberately. "This isn't punishment. It's correction." I wanted to say something, anything to make him stop, to break through the wall of certainty that wrapped around him. But when I opened my mouth, the words dissolved. Fear had become part of my bloodstream. Then, something inside me cracked again, louder this time. I looked at him, not like a son looking at a father, but like a person looking at another person for the first time. He raised his arm, and I stepped forward. "Do it," I said. The words came out steady, not angry, not desperate, just flat, final. He froze mid-motion. The belt hovered in the air. For the first time, he looked uncertain. "What did you say?" "Do it," I repeated. "That's what you want, isn't it? To make me afraid again?" His face changed. It wasn't anger now, it was disbelief, fear, maybe even shame. For a second, I saw something flicker behind his eyes, the realization that the boy in front of him wasn't the same anymore. He lowered the belt slowly, as if it had become too heavy to hold. "Go to your room," he said finally. But I didn't move. I just stood there, staring at him, until he looked away. That was the moment the balance shifted. The invisible chain between us broke, though neither of us said it aloud. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, up the stairs, and into my room. My heart was pounding, but I felt lighter. Terrified, but free. From that day on, something changed in our home. The silence was still there, but it wasn't his anymore. It was mine. I filled it with thoughts I never dared to have before, about what kind of man I wanted to become and what kind I refused to be. My father stopped speaking to me for weeks. He still moved through the house like a shadow, silent, controlled, unreachable, but he avoided my eyes.
My mother tried to fill the gap with small talk, with forced smiles. My sister barely spoke at all. We were all just moving through a house that had lost its gravity. Months passed. I turned 14. I grew taller, older, harder to intimidate. But he still carried that same expression, a quiet, wounded pride that never healed. I think part of him hated me for breaking the spell. The other part, the one he never let me see, maybe understood that I had done what he never could. The last time he ever raised his voice at me was the day I told him I wanted to leave. It was early evening, golden light spilling across the living room walls. "You're still a child. You'll understand when you're older." I looked at him and said, "Maybe you never understood." He didn't hit me. He just turned away. And somehow that hurt even more. I left home the next morning with a single suitcase. My mother cried quietly as she handed me a small envelope of money. My father stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his face unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might stop me. He didn't. "Remember what I taught you." "I will. Just not the way you think." I walked down the street, the sound of my footsteps mixing with the faint hum of cicadas. For the first time, I realized how heavy silence could be. Not the kind he created, but the kind that comes when you finally step outside it. Years later, I still dream of that house. Sometimes I see him standing by the window, staring out into the night, still trying to control what's already gone. And sometimes I see the boy that I used to be, sitting quietly at that wooden table, believing that fear was the same thing as love. Maybe we were both wrong. Because the truth is, obedience can break just like a bone, quietly, suddenly, beyond repair. And when it does, it doesn't make a sound.